To set up the game, place the bark of Ra on the right-hand side of the board. It can go pretty much anywhere you want it to. Then place 6 pawns for each player in the game off the board near the tail section, and place as many lions as there are players in the game, just to the right of the bark of Ra. The object of the game is to move as many of your pawns forward along the snake as you can, from the tail to the head, where they can become enlightened. The first player to achieve 3 enlightened pawns wins the game. However, you'll also have to avoid lions that are moving in the opposite direction and can be controlled by any player. To protect yourself and slow down your opponents, you'll have to strategically maneuver your pawns into special formations called blockades, as well as look for opportunities to speed up your progress through slides and jumps. You'll also have to balance your defensive pawn movement with your offensive lion movement. On your turn, gather the 4 throwing sticks and toss them onto the table. A legal throw should involve at least 1 stick flipping fully around in the air before landing. You can't just drop the sticks onto the table. Notice how many land flat side up versus round side up. Assuming that you have thrown a combination of round and flat sides, you will now make a move. For every flat side up, you receive 2 movement points. You must now apportion those movement points to 2 pieces on the board, either your pawns or lions, or 1 pawn and 1 lion. We'll talk about lions later. The important thing here is that you must split your movement points between 2 different pieces, no fewer and no more. But you can split them any way you wish, even apportioning only 1 point to one piece and all of the rest of your points to the other if that's what you want to do. Every space you move forward along the snake costs 1 movement point. Pawns may only move forward toward the head. They may never move backwards. If it is not possible for you to move 2 different pieces, you forfeit your turn. There are 2 exceptions to this. On your very first turn of the game, you may apportion all of your movement points to the single pawn you get to move on this turn. Similarly, if you end up with only 1 pawn left in the game on the board or waiting to enter, you may optionally apportion all of your movement points to that pawn on your turn. Note, however, that you may always elect to use fewer than your full number of movement points on your turn as long as you move 2 pieces. Similarly, you may also just choose to forfeit your turn altogether. Whenever your pawn lands on another pawn, it receives a free move called sliding. Without expending any extra movement points, move your pawn to the next available space. Your pawn can slide over multiple other pawns during its move. However, when 2 pawns of the same color are on adjacent spaces, they form a blockade. Whenever you land on a blockaded pawn, you must move off of it with regular movement points. If you've been sliding, your slide ends as soon as you land on a blockaded pawn. You can never end your turn on another pawn, so you must always move through a blockade until you reach the next available space. You can, however, sometimes both slide before and after a blockade. All is the same movement, as long as you use movement points to move off of blockaded pawns. As soon as you move onto another pawn that's not blockaded, you can continue to slide. Blockades can also be formed across coils. A blockade involves at least 2 pawns, but can involve as many as you like. Remember that you are restricted by movement through your own blockades as well as your opponent's blockades. One final restriction: while you can slide over your own pieces, you cannot slide using a pawn that was previously slid over on your same turn. 1, 2, 3. If you have enough movement points for it, you can expend 5 to do a special move called a jump. A jump is from one space to a touching space on a completely different coil. You cannot jump onto a space that's occupied by another piece. Sometimes you have a choice of multiple potential spaces that you can jump to. There is one important restriction on jumping. The spaces of the innermost coil, extending from the head up to the space directly behind the head, can never be jumped from. This goes both for pawns moving toward the head and lions moving toward the tail. Remember, you can jump to these spaces, but never from them. Once there's at least 1 lion on the board, players may move lions as one or both of their pieces. Any player, of course, can move any lion. You apportion movement points to lions as you would a pawn, And lions move just like pawns, except that they start at the head and move toward the tail. They must always move toward the tail. They can never move backwards. Lions may never slide. If a lion moves onto a pawn, it devours that pawn. Remove it from the game. Lions can do a special jumping move. While they can jump normally using 5 movement points to any space, they can also jump with only 1 movement point if it is to move onto a pawn to devour it. Remember, however, that lions, like pawns, are restricted from jumping from any of the spaces in the inner coil. Lions have another special move that they can take called sprinting. A sprinting lion can move double the number of movement points you've allotted to it, but it may not land on a pawn during this same turn. It can be an effective way to move lions rapidly, either to endanger your opponents on subsequent turns or to move a lion past one of your own pawns to render it safe. This is one of the most powerful uses of sprinting in general. When a lion moves onto the tail, it is removed from the board. It is now available to return to the head to replace the next enlightened pawn. The center space of the board is the head. The head is special in that any number of pieces can occupy it at the same time, including both pawns and lions. Whenever all 4 of your throwing sticks come up the same, whether that's the flat side or the round side, this is a special throw called the Mehen throw. When a player throws this, Mehen, the god, gets to take a move. On the very first Mehen throw of the game, move 1 lion into the bark of Ra. On the second Mehen throw of the game, move the lion from the bark of Ra into the center of the board, but not onto the head. On the third Mehen throw of the game, move the lion onto the head. It is now in play and can be moved by any player. If there are any pawns currently on the head, they have achieved enlightenment. Move them into the bark of Ra. They now count towards players' final scores in the game. If there are lions available off the board, replace the enlightened pawns with lions at the head. Next, during a Mehen move, every single pawn on the board is moved 2 spaces toward the head, beginning with the pawn closest to the head. If a pawn is pulled into the head as a result of a Mehen move, it is devoured by Mehen, the god, and removed from the game. Similarly, if a pawn is moved into or through a lion, it is devoured by that lion and removed from the game. All other pawns are simply moved forward 2 spaces. Always trace outward along the spiral and move the pawns in that order. Lions remain stationary during a Mehen move. After you've resolved the Mehen move, the player who threw the Mehen may now throw again. It's possible to throw another Mehen, in which case you would then resolve that Mehen move and throw again, as long as the player eventually receives a normal movement. The game ends once 1 player has moved 3 pawns into the bark of Ra. At that point, the player with the most pawns in the bark of Ra wins. Note that sometimes that could be more than 3 if a single Mehen move results in 1 player achieving 3 and another player achieving 3 or 4. Thus, the game could be a tie, or it could be won by someone with 4 pawns in the bark of Ra. If no player achieves 3 pawns in the bark of Ra, once all the players have been eliminated, the game is over, and the player with the most pawns in the bark of Ra wins. That's all you need to know in order to play Mehen. This video did not cover the optional advanced rules, which give you 2 other special moves, gated blockades and the push. There's also an optional rule that allows lions to jump 3 spaces sooner to speed up the game and increase its danger. And there's also a really fun variant called Team Mehen for advanced players, where teams of 2 join together. I hope you enjoy playing Mehen.